Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much. I think we need to move on, and I would love to introduce Dr. Eleonore Lebre, who will talk to us about the complex all bodies database.
Okay, so I just use the mouse, right? If I want
Yeah,
to.
hit the mouse or the arrow key on the keyboard.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm presenting our latest paper, latest output from the Complex All-Bodies Database project. So the paper is titled "The Social and Environmental Complexities of Extracting Energy Transition Metals." It was published recently in Nature Communications. So this is the list of my co-authors. It's a very multidisciplinary team. We've got researchers and directors from the production, environment, and social centers of the Institute. Special thanks to Martin and Camila who are in the room. I couldn't have done it without you. Thanks for your help. So a bit about the context. It's a bit similar to previous presentations that, because it's again about the idea of just transitions and the fact that low carbon energy technologies have high metal requirements. So someone has mentioned the World Bank report before, so that the latest report has identified something like 17 different metals that are key for the energy transition. Other reports identify more than 20. I wanted to point out here that there are specialty metals that are quite well known and they maybe get the most attention. It's, for example, lithium and cobalt, but there is also major metals like iron and copper that are needed for basically a lot of things around the technology and inside the technology that they are crucial for storing, transport, and generation of low carbon energy. And these metals are needed in higher quantity than lithium or cobalt or other specialty metals that are needed for very specific applications. So the global demand for these technologies is expected to result in an increased mining production. So that's the question of the just transition, because this will generate particular types of pressure on host communities and environments in the places where mining activities are located. And the literature has raised concerns about this. Like we hear a lot about cobalt being mined in Democratic Republic of Congo and these issues that it could raise, but it's never been quantified on a global scale and in a systematic way like we did in this paper. So the approach, we are relying on the S&P Global Market Intelligence database, which provides us the location of mining projects, as well as the commodity and the reserves and resources estimated, the most recent estimations of reserves and resources for different commodities that are being mined or will be mined in the future. And so we base our analysis on 7,000 different mining projects, some operating, some in early stage of development, pre-production, 20 different metal commodities. And we did this special overlay that was already the approach for previous presentations, for example, Anthony's presentation, also Laura's presentation, where we define a set of environmental, social, and governance indicators that kind of reflect the context, the external context in which mining operations are being developed. So these are factors of risk and factors of vulnerability within the context of mining locations. So in practice, what it looks like is you have one map with points of mining projects, and on the other side, you have lots of different maps that will be spatially overlaid. The way it looks like on this right side with those different maps is in practice, we have something like 25 different measures that are coming from different institutions like the World Bank, the UNEP, World Resources Institute, some academic groups as well. And we aggregate them into different dimensions. We've got 3 environmental dimensions, 3 social dimensions, and 1 governance dimension. And then we aggregate them further into 1 total ESG score. I won't go too much into the details of these different dimensions, but I think the process of defining these dimensions was first with the initial ideas from Rick and different these discussions that we've had with the different experts within the SMI, that dimensions that are key for representing environmental, social, and governance risks around mining. So yeah, I'm happy to take questions about this if there is time later on, but I don't want to take too much time on the method. I wanted to get to the results relatively quickly. So that was actually a big question, and actually a part of the making this paper that took quite a while was because there are 7 ESG dimensions, right? And then we aggregate them into 3 ESG dimensions, and then total ESG score. So basically we can make 10 different graphs comparing all of the different commodities that we looked at for the different dimensions. And we can also look at it spatially and make maps and see where our risk factors are located on the map. And given the requirements of the journal that we were targeting, we knew that we had just space for 2 big figures. So our choice was to have one first relying on graphs and comparing commodities together, and the second half, the second figure, relying on maps and talking about more the geography of the risk distribution. So two sides of the results, as I said. First, the community comparison. Relatively complex picture, so I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this slide. So on the left side, you can see the first 3 columns are the environmental dimensions, then the second 3 are the social dimensions, then they both get aggregated into the environmental and the social columns. There is also the governance column, so that adds up in terms of all the dimensions that we were looking at. And then these 3 main dimensions are aggregated into this combined ESG score. And so colors are quite hopefully understandable. Is blue would be lower risk, whereas darker red would be higher risk. And we break down the ESG score by reserves and resources. So each mining point has declared estimated reserves and resources value. So when you look at the 7,000 different sites, you can break down the results by on this colorful scale. So from there, we focused on 9 metals that had a lot of literature to rely on. So platinum and cobalt would be, with our estimation, would be the most at risk. So the commodities that have the highest accumulation of different risk dimensions across all of the different sites that are extracting or going to extract these commodities. So platinum would come first and cobalt second. So noting that 84% of reserves and resources for platinum are in medium to high risk context, 70% for cobalt. Then something else interesting to look at, I was talking about the difference between specialty metals and major metals. That's where the difference comes up, because so the second half on the right side of this figure is with the help from Martin, who's found a very clever way to compare the different commodities and link them to the future demand for low carbon energy technologies. And so when we look at the estimated projected demand compared to the current global production, that's where you see that specialty metals, because they were not needed before, but they are going to be needed in the future, relatively speaking, the increase in demand is huge. So that's where you see, okay, for mining these commodities, transformation in the sector will be very important, because you come from not much mining to a lot of mining. So that's where you see, okay, yeah, there is big changes coming up for specialty commodities. And while cobalt, for example, is really on the top of the scale when it comes to ESG risks, lithium is a bit lower, but you can see, for example, lithium has a relatively important water risk, which confirms previous observations that lithium mining would take place in quite water scarce regions. then then I think the more interesting part for me was the really pointing out the importance of the major metals like copper and iron, because they're metals that are already used a lot. So when you compare future demand with current demand, it doesn't look like a big thing. But if you look at the actually the amount of metal that will be needed for the deployment of low carbon energy technologies, and you then from there you estimate the material movement that will happen at mine site, so the amount of ore tonnage that will be needed to be extracted and processed. That's where you see that these metals, actually, when it comes to mining, they will be the ones causing the most land disturbance related to the energy transition. So I think looking at the risks that are associated with these particular commodities when it comes to mining will be quite important. So that's for the first part of the results. Second part, as I said, was looking at the map of the risks. So first, so this map made by Camila was, I'll spend a bit more time explaining it because there was a bit of confusion about what we really meant by this. Again, it was a choice of, given the size of the paper, we could not explore all the visualization possibilities. There's clearly much more we can do. So that choice was to focus on hotspots and cold spots. Hotspots are defined as high concentration of projects that are located in like the sum of environmental and social dimensions together. So having a high environmental and social score. So that means a high complexity, a high vulnerability of the social and environmental context around these projects. And it also means these projects are close together. So it's a concentration of these projects. So it means high vulnerability, high complexity. And it means that the accumulation of risks makes it particularly, makes it more challenging to find solutions that will address all of the risk dimensions together. So emphasis on need for multidisciplinary solutions, integrated and everything. Whereas cold spots, so emphasizing that cold spot doesn't mean there is no risk. It means that, so it's also an idea of concentration. So if a mine is in a cold spot, it means also that there is lots of mines around it. So it's still, there is a possible cumulative risk from the proximity of different mines together. So there is a regional cumulative risk, but it means that the environmental and social risk score for individual points is relatively low. So it doesn't mean no risk. It can be that, as you recall, there is 7 risk dimensions. There can be 1 or 2 risk dimensions that are still high, and the rest are low, and so the overall score is low. But it means, it doesn't mean no risk, but it does mean less complexity, and it means that there may be solutions more readily available to address one particular risk dimension that don't require very high understanding of the overall complexity. So, and then comparing this to the governance risk. So why is it important to compare the environmental and social vulnerability at the point of the mine, and then the kind of overarching governance background around the mines. Governance will tell you something about the capacity within the country to develop or maintain safeguards to protect people and the environment. So if you have hotspots in good governance countries, then there is still hope that there are going to be safeguards that will prevent some of the potential harm to happen. And then the last part of the figure was looking at the top countries, so seeing that Australia and the United States have the highest, the largest, well, if you sum all of the ESG scores from all the mines, then they arrive on top, not just because there's lots of high risk context, but also because Australia and United States will have a lot of mining points. So it's the cumulative effect, right? And so when you look, so in this top 15 list, you will have Australia, United States, and Canada that have a good governance score compared to other countries, whereas, and Chile as well. And the rest of the top 15 are in below average governance. So that part gives you quite a bit of information about the location of the risk and the implications for jurisdictions that where the mining activity is located. So this is my last slide. So I think I'm okay with time. So first, what I wanted to say with this is, yeah, I guess it remains a very global analysis. There's lots of data uncertainty, so I would advise to use. So we've tried to have useful conclusions, but at the same time careful ones. We don't want to draw very strong conclusions from this. So reminding that it's based on known activities, because the S&P database will only contain data about sites that have been reported. So there's a lot more that is likely to be unreported. The S&P database is one of the most complete sources that we have, that we can have access to. But yeah, reminding ourselves that there is much more in reality that we don't know about. Again, yeah, our analysis is on external factors of vulnerability. So it tells us a lot about the context where mining is taking place, but it doesn't tell us about the industry response to this context. So I think it's a big question for the future, is understanding what's happening within the site and not. So there are factors of vulnerability, but they don't tell us actually whether risks are going to transform into impacts in practice. And we have proxies. So yeah, reminding ourselves that also the data set that we use we wanted to represent a certain reality, but it's not necessarily, it's limited by the fact that we have having this global analysis, and data is not always as representative as we would like it to be. So just a couple of notes on the results. So I think the usefulness of this work is, I think the first part of the results, the community profiles, we highlighted different complexities and potential constraints. So particularly, I think recently there was an understanding that cobalt was actually going to be quite tricky to mine with the expected future demand. And so, yeah, in that case, it can trigger a response from the manufacturers that are developing those batteries and then thinking about alternative materials that can be used instead of cobalt, and particular risks, for example, like understanding that water efficient solutions will probably need to be addressed for the case of lithium, for example. Also identifying hotspots and locations. So something that we didn't do, we looked at the hotspots and the cold spots, but what would also be interesting to look at is the particular combinations of specific ESG risks. So for example, what does it mean if you have a whole, let's say, a cold spot area that has water and land use risks, but not the other risks? So what are these special combinations meaning for this particular jurisdiction, for this particular region? So understanding this data and using this data could prompt governments and investors and other actors to address specific and sometimes more acute forms of risk. So I'm hoping that this work will inform different actors on how to take the next steps to adjust energy transition. So thank you.
Thank you, Eleonore. I think we have time for one question. Does anybody in the lecture theatre have a question?
Thanks, Eleonore. That's really interesting. It's a really good way to put the story out there. That's very interesting. Just a minor question, I guess. When you were considering those mining sites, were they purely mining sites, or were they downstream sites such as smelters, etc.? And if so, how did you account for those differences?
So it was only mining sites. So, and in the S&P database, we have also, so as I said, different stages of development. So what we had was mining projects that were in past the initial exploration. So from advanced exploration to operation and expansion and all of these operating stages.